Imagine standing at the edge of a quiet lake at dawn. The surface is still, mirror-like, reflecting the soft hues of the morning sky. A gentle wind brushes across the water, rippling its surface for a moment before the lake settles back into its serene calm. That fleeting disturbance, so temporary, so delicate, reminds us of something profound. The world is full of passing winds. Some warm us, some chill us, yet none of them last. In our lives, praise and blame are much like these winds. A compliment can lift us, swelling our chest with pride, making the world seem brighter. A criticism can sting, leaving us unsettled, questioning our worth or even our purpose. Both praise and blame are powerful in the moment, but fleeting just as the wind is fleeting. Yet how often do we let them control us? How often do we chase after approval, longing for recognition, or shrink in fear of disapproval? We give them the power to shape our moods, our decisions, even our sense of self. And in doing so, we lose touch with the calm that lies beneath all that noise. The Buddha taught that clinging to fleeting experiences, whether pleasurable or painful, is the root of suffering. Praise is pleasant, yet impermanent. Blame is unpleasant, yet impermanent. Neither is a reliable guide to who we truly are. They are winds, passing, uncontrollable, beyond our ownership. To chase them, to run after them, is to be swept away by forces that do not belong to us. Consider a child learning to walk. When the child falls, parents may cheer and encourage, or sometimes frown and scold. The child wobbles, teeters, and then continues walking, mostly unaware of the praise or blame surrounding them. There is a purity in this, an innocence that allows growth without attachment. As adults, we forget this. We forget that our true balance comes not from external applause or criticism, but from a steadiness within. Every day, in subtle ways, we encounter these winds. A colleague praises a project, a friend questions a decision, a stranger leaves a comment on social media. And with each gust, our minds ripple. Some of us inflate with pride, some of us contract with shame, while very few of us remain untouched. Yet the lake, the wind, the ripples, they all exist outside of us. Only our reaction gives them weight. What if we could watch these winds pass without letting them disturb the surface of our mind? What if we could receive praise without being carried away, encounter blame without shrinking, and maintain a quiet center untouched by the fleeting opinions of the world? This is not a call to indifference. It is a call to freedom. Praise and blame, like the wind, are neutral in themselves. They are neither good nor bad, and they carry no intrinsic value beyond the meaning we assign to them. By observing them without attachment, we discover a kind of liberty that is impervious to the changing moods of the world. Over the next journey, we will explore why chasing these winds keeps us restless, how our mind can be trained to remain calm, and how ancient wisdom from the Buddha and the Zen masters offers practical ways to navigate praise and blame without losing ourselves. We will hear stories of people who have been buffeted by winds of recognition and criticism, and how they found stillness where others would have found turbulence. We will uncover the subtle tricks our mind plays, the illusions of external validation, and the quiet power that comes from embracing impermanence. By the end of this path, the goal is simple yet profound: to learn how to live with grace, balance, and clarity, untouched by the winds that brush across the surface of our lives. To feel the wind, yes, but not to be swept away. To witness praise and blame, yes, but not to be defined by them. And in that calm, in that steady center, we begin to recognize something even more beautiful. That true peace has always been within us, waiting for the winds to pass. Have you ever noticed how a single word can change the rhythm of your day? A compliment from a colleague, a smile of approval from a friend, or even a simple "well done" can lift your spirits like sunlight breaking through clouds. And yet, a sharp criticism, a dismissive glance, or a whispered judgment can weigh down your mind, making you question your abilities, your choices, even your value. Praise and blame, so small in form, yet so enormous in effect. At first glance, they seem opposite, one positive, one negative. But in essence, both are the same. They are reflections of other people's perceptions, mirrors that tell us more about them than about ourselves. A compliment is not a permanent truth about you. It is merely someone's appreciation in a fleeting moment. A criticism is not a verdict on your worth. It is merely someone's observation, filtered through their own experiences, biases, and moods. Both are passing winds, carrying temporary energy, yet neither defines the lake of your inner being. In the teachings of the Buddha, attachment to approval or fear of disapproval is called a form of grasping. Grasping to praise makes the heart dependent on outside validation. Grasping to avoid blame creates anxiety and self-doubt. Both disturb the calm mind, like a rock thrown into still water, sending ripples in every direction. The mind loses its clarity, and we forget that our value, our essence, does not rise or fall with the judgments of others. Stories from Zen masters illustrate this beautifully. There is the tale of a monk who was praised for his wisdom and suddenly became prideful, forgetting the very teachings he had devoted his life to. Another monk was scolded harshly by a visitor and spent days in agitation, questioning his practice. In both cases, the disturbance came not from the praise or blame itself, but from the attachment to it. When the mind identifies with these external winds, it loses its freedom. Praise and blame are, in a way, illusions created by the mind. They are like reflections on the surface of water, visible, tempting to reach for, yet intangible. If we dive after them, we find nothing but emptiness. And yet, because humans naturally seek recognition and fear rejection, we are often drawn into chasing them, letting our inner weather be dictated by forces entirely outside our control. The danger lies not in praise or blame themselves, but in the way we react. Praise can feed the ego, leading to pride and complacency. Blame can fuel fear, doubt, or resentment. Both can trap us in cycles of seeking and avoiding, of craving and fearing, pulling us further from the simplicity and clarity that the Buddha called freedom from attachments. Understanding this nature is the first step toward liberation. Imagine standing on a cliff while a gust of wind blows across your face. If you lean into it, it can push you off balance. If you resist it, it can feel uncomfortable. But if you simply allow it to pass, you feel the wind, notice its presence, and yet remain rooted in your own center. Praise and blame work the same way. They exist, they will touch your life, but they do not have to disturb your inner calm. This recognition opens a door to mindfulness. To observe praise and blame without grasping or rejecting is to begin a journey towards self-mastery. It is not a denial of human experience. It is an acknowledgement that these winds will always come, yet they need not define us. In every interaction, in every comment, in every fleeting judgment, there is an opportunity to cultivate awareness, to practice detachment, and to witness the impermanence of all things. And here lies the subtle power of understanding their nature. Once you see that praise and blame are external, temporary, and ultimately neutral, you can stop giving them the control they once held. You begin to respond from clarity rather than reaction, from intention rather than fear, and from wisdom rather than craving. Your life becomes a lake, rippling with the touch of winds but never losing its depth and stillness. As we explore further, we will see why chasing external validation, the pursuit of praise and the avoidance of blame, can keep us restless and unfulfilled. We will uncover the hidden traps of ego and fear that lie beneath our reactions, and discover practical ways to cultivate resilience, balance, and peace even in the face of the world's ever-changing opinions. For now, pause and reflect. The winds will touch you, but they are not yours to carry. They are simply passing. It's a curious thing, isn't it? How much of our lives we spend seeking the nods of others, the smiles that signal approval, the words that affirm our worth. From childhood to adulthood, the story is the same. We are taught, subtly and overtly, that recognition equals value. A grade, a compliment, a like on social media, they all whisper the same promise. You are seen, you are enough. But beneath this promise lies a quiet deception, an illusion that can easily entangle the mind. External validation is seductive because it appeals to something innate within us, the desire to belong, to be acknowledged, to matter. Praise feels like sunlight. It warms us, giving the illusion that we are radiant, visible, and meaningful. Blame feels like shadows. It chills us, suggesting we are flawed, insufficient, or rejected. And so we chase the sunlight and flee the shadows, believing that our happiness, our peace, depends on the fluctuating opinions of others. Yet what happens when the sunlight fades, when the smiles disappear, or when the likes stop coming? Suddenly, the sense of worth we built on external validation wobbles, unsteady as a house of cards. This is the trap. Relying on external sources for internal stability is like planting roots in shifting sand. The winds of praise and blame will come and go, always unpredictable, never fully in our control. The Buddha warned of this subtle snare. He observed that craving recognition or fearing criticism is a form of attachment, and attachment inevitably leads to suffering. In chasing validation, we hand over the reins of our emotional life to forces outside ourselves. Our moods, decisions, and self-perception become dependent on the approval of people whose perspectives are limited, biased, or temporary. In essence, we give strangers power over our inner peace. Consider modern life. Social media has amplified this phenomenon exponentially. Every post, every share, every comment has the potential to lift or sink our sense of self. A fleeting like can trigger a surge of elation, while a critical remark can leave us spiraling. And yet, what do these external markers really reveal about us? Nothing permanent, nothing real. They are merely reflections, distorted, incomplete, transient reflections of a world that is constantly in flux. Even in more personal interactions, the same illusion persists. A colleague's praise may flatter, but it says as much about their perspective as it does about your work. A friend's criticism may sting, but it reflects their expectations, values, and moods, not your intrinsic worth. To cling to these signals is to mistake shadows for substance, reflections for reality. The liberation begins when we see clearly. External validation is just that, external. It is not a measure of our true being. True value, the Buddha teaches, arises from integrity, mindfulness, and wisdom, not from the applause of the crowd or the disapproval of others. When we root ourselves in this internal steadiness, the winds of praise and blame may brush against us, but they cannot sway us. The lake remains calm, the mirror clear, no matter what images ripple across its surface. And yet, this awareness is only the first step. Knowing that external validation is illusory is not the same as feeling free from it. The mind is clever. It will continue to seek approval, to recoil from criticism, often without our conscious notice. The next step is to cultivate a steady observation, a mindfulness that allows us to notice these cravings and fears as they arise, to watch them pass without being pulled along. It is like standing on a cliff, feeling the wind on your face, and realizing that you are not the wind, nor the leaves it stirs. You are the solid rock, unmoved, enduring, steady. This understanding transforms every interaction, every moment of recognition or judgment, into an opportunity. Every word of praise or blame becomes a teacher, showing us where our attachments lie, revealing the illusions we habitually chase. Instead of seeking or fleeing, we observe. Instead of reacting, we respond. And in that space between stimulus and reaction, a quiet freedom begins to emerge. It is in this realization that we glimpse a deeper truth. The world will always have opinions, and people will always judge, but we do not have to participate in their turbulence. We can witness the winds, feel their touch, and yet remain anchored in the clarity of our own awareness. We are not defined by external applause or disapproval. We are defined by the steadiness of our inner mind, by the choices we make, and by the depth of our presence in every moment. As we continue this journey, we will explore the subtle costs of chasing praise and avoiding blame, the ways these habits quietly erode our happiness and distort our perception of self. And then, we will learn practical ways to cultivate the calm and clarity that make it possible to feel the winds without being carried away. The illusion of external validation is powerful, but it is not invincible. With awareness, practice, and patience, we begin to see the winds for what they are: passing, uncontrollable, and ultimately, irrelevant to the peace that lies within. There is a sweetness in praise, isn't there? When someone says, "You're talented," or "That was incredible," it feels like the heart expands. For a moment, we glow, we stand taller, we feel validated. Praise can feel like sunlight after a long winter, warming the soul. But just as the sun sets, praise too is fleeting. And when we begin to chase it, to depend on it, that warmth quickly becomes a trap. Imagine a performer stepping onto a stage. The applause is thunderous, the cheers intoxicating. In that moment, the performer feels alive, important, even invincible. But when the curtain falls and the audience goes home, silence returns. If the performer has tied their sense of worth to that applause, the silence feels unbearable. The next performance is no longer about the art, the passion, or the truth. It becomes about earning that applause again, at any cost. The pursuit of praise has replaced the joy of creation. This is the hidden cost of chasing praise. It shifts our motivation. Instead of doing what is meaningful, we start doing what is applauded. Instead of living with integrity, we start living for approval. The self becomes distorted, shaped not by inner wisdom, but by outer recognition. We become performers in the theater of life, wearing masks to win claps, afraid to reveal our true selves for fear they will not be applauded. The Buddha called this a subtle form of bondage. When the mind clings to praise, it is not free. Every action, every choice, every word is filtered through the question, will this be admired? But admiration is as fickle as the wind. One day it lifts you, the next day it abandons you. To chase it is to run endlessly, never finding rest. There is also a more insidious cost, the inflation of ego. Praise can intoxicate, leading us to believe we are greater than we are, that we stand above others, that we deserve recognition simply for being who we are. This pride is fragile because it is built on external voices rather than internal truth. The higher the ego swells, the more painful the fall when the winds change. History and daily life alike are full of stories of people undone by praise. Leaders who once sought only to serve began to crave admiration, and in doing so, lost their humility. Artists who once created out of love began to chase the crowd's approval, and in doing so, lost their authenticity. Ordinary people, like you and me, can also fall into this cycle, posting, speaking, acting not because it is true, but because it might win applause. And in each case, the cost is the same, the quiet erosion of freedom, peace, and authenticity. But perhaps the greatest cost of all is that chasing praise makes us strangers to ourselves. We stop listening to the still voice within, the compass of our own heart, and instead orient our lives toward the ever-changing opinions of others. In this way, we become like leaves blown in the wind, moved here and there, but never rooted. Zen masters often used simple imagery to remind us of this truth. One story tells of a monk praised for his eloquence. The more people applauded, the more he prepared words designed to impress, until his speech was no longer authentic, but a performance. When a teacher asked him why he spoke, the monk hesitated. He realized he no longer spoke to share truth, but to earn praise. In that moment, he saw how far he had drifted from his path. The lesson is clear. Praise is not poison, but chasing it is. To receive praise with gratitude and then let it pass is harmless. But to run after it, to shape our lives in pursuit of it, is to surrender our freedom and our authenticity. The cost is subtle but profound, a life lived not for truth, but for approval. And yet, awareness is the key. By noticing how praise affects us, by watching the craving arise, we begin to loosen its grip. We can still enjoy kind words without being bound by them, still accept recognition without chasing it. Like a breeze that cools us for a moment, we can feel praise, smile, and let it pass, knowing that our worth is not tied to the winds of others' voices. As we journey deeper, we will turn our gaze to the other side of the same coin, the cost of fearing blame. If chasing praise is a chain that binds us, fear of blame is the weight that drags us down. Together, they keep us from the freedom and stillness that is possible when we no longer measure ourselves by the world's ever-changing winds. If chasing praise feels like running toward the sun, then fearing blame feels like constantly running from the shadows. It is a weight we carry in secret, a quiet tension that shapes our choices more than we realize. Fear of blame whispers in our ears. Don't stand out. Don't make mistakes. Don't upset anyone. And so, instead of living fully, we live cautiously, guided not by wisdom or integrity, but by the dread of disapproval. Think of the countless times you held back a truth, swallowed your voice, or chose the safer path, not because it was right, but because you feared being judged. Maybe you wanted to pursue a passion but worried, what will people say? Maybe you longed to make a change but hesitated, fearing criticism. The weight of possible blame became heavier than the call of your own heart. This is the hidden cost. When fear of blame governs us, we trade authenticity for approval and courage for comfort. We shrink ourselves to fit into the narrow expectations of others, forgetting that those expectations are as shifting as the wind. What pleases one person displeases another. What earns applause today may invite criticism tomorrow. To live in fear of blame is to walk endlessly on eggshells, never free to take a bold step. The Buddha understood this burden deeply. He himself faced harsh words and false accusations during his lifetime, yet he remained unmoved, neither clinging to praise nor fearing blame. He taught that blame, like praise, is impermanent and unreliable. It tells us nothing absolute about who we are. But when we fear it, when we allow it to dictate our choices, it becomes a prison. Fear of blame also robs us of resilience. Every word of criticism becomes a wound, every judgment a storm. We forget that criticism is inevitable in a world where perspectives differ, where no action pleases everyone. And so we suffer twice, first from the blame itself and then from the fear of receiving it. Consider a story. A young artist paints with joy, pouring their heart onto the canvas. One day, a critic mocks their work, calling it childish. The artist, devastated, stops painting altogether, not because the art lost its meaning, but because the fear of more blame became unbearable. In that moment, the critic's voice became more powerful than the artist's own. The true tragedy is not the harsh words spoken, but the life unlived because of fear. When fear of blame rules us, even silence becomes a trap. We avoid speaking out against injustice, avoid standing for what is right, avoid living authentically, because the possibility of criticism feels too heavy. And yet, in trying to avoid the sting of blame, we invite another kind of suffering, regret. Regret for the words unsaid, the actions unchosen, the self never fully expressed. Zen masters remind us that blame, like praise, is simply wind. Sometimes it howls, sometimes it whispers, but it always passes. A master once said, if someone hands you a gift and you do not accept it, who does it belong to? In the same way, if someone offers blame and you do not take it into your heart, it remains theirs, not yours. To fear it is to assume ownership of something that was never truly ours to carry. But how do we live without fear of blame? The answer lies not in avoiding criticism, but in accepting its inevitability. To live authentically is to invite both approval and disapproval. To act with integrity is to risk misunderstanding. The question is not whether blame will come, but whether we will allow it to shackle our spirit. The cost of fearing blame is high. It steals our courage, distorts our path, and leaves us living half-lives in the shadows of others' opinions. Yet when we see its nature clearly, we begin to loosen its grip. We can meet blame with curiosity rather than fear, discern whether it carries truth, and let the rest blow past us like wind over water. In learning to release this fear, we reclaim something precious, the freedom to live fully, to speak truthfully, to act boldly, even if others disapprove. We begin to realize that peace is not found in avoiding criticism, but in standing firm in who we are, unmoved by the shifting winds of praise and blame. As our journey unfolds, we will explore how mindfulness allows us to watch these winds without being swept away, to observe praise and blame as passing breezes, while the lake of the mind remains calm, deep, and clear. Imagine standing in a vast open field. The wind blows from the east, then shifts to the west. It brushes against your skin, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, sometimes fierce, sometimes gentle. If you chase it, you exhaust yourself. If you fear it, you shrink away. But if you simply stand, rooted and aware, you notice something remarkable. The wind passes, and you remain. This is the essence of mindfulness in the face of praise and blame. To be mindful is not to fight the winds, nor to run after them, but to observe them with calm awareness. Praise arrives like a sweet breeze. It feels good, refreshing, affirming. Blame comes like a harsh gust. It stings, rattles, unsettles. Yet both are temporary movements in the air, not lasting truths about who you are. Mindfulness invites us to pause before reacting. Instead of immediately basking in praise or recoiling from criticism, we take a breath. We notice, this is praise. This is blame. Just words, just sounds, just whines brushing against the surface of the mind. In this pause, we reclaim freedom. We are no longer dragged helplessly by every shifting gust. The Buddha once compared the mind to a great mountain. Winds may strike it from all directions, but the mountain remains unmoved. When we practice mindfulness, we cultivate that same mountain-like stability. Praise may flatter us, blame may sting, yet deep within, there is a stillness untouched by either. Consider a simple moment. Someone compliments you, "You're amazing." Without mindfulness, your ego leaps forward, grasping at the words, craving more. But with mindfulness, you smile inwardly and note, "This is pleasant, this is impermanent." The words bring warmth, but you do not cling. Later, someone criticizes you, you failed. Without mindfulness, you shrink, defensive, or wounded. But with mindfulness, you breathe and note, "This is unpleasant, this too is impermanent." You hear the sting, but it does not define you. In this way, mindfulness turns the winds into teachers. Each gust reminds us of impermanence, each breeze points us back to our inner stillness. Instead of being tossed about, we learn to watch. And in watching, we discover something profound. Our true self is not the praise we receive, nor the blame we endure, but the awareness that witnesses both. Mindfulness also reveals the emptiness of external validation. When you sit quietly, observing thoughts and feelings arise and fade, you notice how quickly praise loses its glow and how blame loses its sting. Both dissolve like footprints in sand, washed away by the tide of awareness. This seeing brings liberation, for you realize that neither applause nor criticism has the power to touch the core of who you are. Zen teachers often say, "Let the winds blow, hold your ground." Not out of stubbornness, but out of clarity. For when you observe without clinging, the winds become harmless. You no longer fear them, nor do you chase them. You allow them to be, and in that allowing, you find peace. But mindfulness is not just a practice on the meditation cushion. It is a way of walking through the world. In conversations, in moments of success, in times of failure, we can carry this awareness with us. When praised, we bow gently without grasping. When blamed, we bow gently without resisting. Each moment becomes an opportunity to practice balance, to breathe, to remain grounded like a tree rooted deeply in the earth. And here lies the beauty. Mindfulness transforms what once enslaved us into a path of freedom. The winds no longer dictate our direction. They come and go while we remain steady, walking with clarity and compassion. As we move deeper into this journey, we will explore how true freedom arises, not in controlling the winds, but in letting go of the need to control at all. For the art of letting go reveals a truth even greater than stability. It reveals liberation. When we first encounter praise and blame, they feel like forces outside our control, winds that either lift us up or push us down. But mindfulness teaches us something extraordinary. These winds are not enemies. They are teachers, and if we meet them with awareness, we can transform them into wisdom. Think of praise. At first, it feels like nourishment. We thrive on it like plants reaching for sunlight. But with mindfulness, praise becomes more than a pleasant experience. It becomes a mirror. In the glow of kind words, we can ask, "Am I being recognized for what is genuine or for a mask I wear? Do these words point me toward deeper truth, or are they simply passing reflections?" Praise, when observed wisely, shows us where we are clinging and where we are free. And blame, though painful, offers an even sharper mirror. Criticism often reveals places we have yet to see clearly. Sometimes it is exaggerated or unfair, yet within it there may be a seed of truth. Instead of recoiling, we can ask, "Is there something here I can learn? Can I use these words not as chains, but as stepping stones?" In this way, even the sting of blame becomes a teacher, guiding us toward humility, patience, and self-awareness. There is a Zen saying, "The obstacle is the path." Praise and blame, once seen as obstacles, can become the very path to wisdom. Each compliment tests our humility. Each criticism tests our resilience. Together, they refine the heart like fire refining gold. Without them, we might remain untested, unshaken, and therefore unawakened. Imagine a traveler climbing a mountain. Along the way, some villagers cheer and encourage, while others jeer and criticize. If the traveler stops to cling to the cheers or collapse under the jeers, the journey halts. But if the traveler sees both as sounds on the wind, learns from them, and continues upward, every word, pleasant or harsh, becomes fuel for the climb. This is how wisdom grows, by transforming experiences into insight. Praise teaches us about impermanence and the danger of attachment. Blame teaches us about ego and the opportunity for growth. Together, they reveal the truth that our worth is not in the voices outside, but in the clarity within. And something beautiful happens when we truly understand this. Praise no longer intoxicates us, blame no longer paralyzes us. Instead, we meet both with gratitude. Praise reminds us to stay humble. Blame reminds us to stay awake. Each becomes a doorway, leading us deeper into freedom. The Buddha once said that just as a solid rock remains unmoved by the wind, so too does the wise remain unmoved by praise and blame. But this does not mean indifference or coldness. It means seeing clearly, using every gust of wind as an opportunity to strengthen our roots and broaden our vision. When we live this way, something shifts. Praise and blame lose their power to control us, and instead, they serve us. They become teachers, not masters, winds, not storms. And in that moment, we realize that the world's voices can guide us, but they cannot define us. As the journey deepens, we will turn our attention to the heart of freedom itself, the power of liberation. For beyond transforming these winds into wisdom lies an even greater truth, the art of being free from them altogether. It is one thing to speak of winds and mountains, of praise and blame as passing breezes. But how do we live this truth in the messy, unpredictable rhythm of daily life? How do we carry wisdom not just on the meditation cushion, but into the workplace, the home, the marketplace, and the very heart of our relationships? The answer is simple, yet profound. Practice begins with awareness in ordinary moments. Imagine walking into work. Your colleague praises your effort on a project, saying, "You're brilliant." Without mindfulness, your heart leaps, ego basking in the glow. But if you pause, you breathe and silently note, "Pleasant words, temporary." You still appreciate the kindness, but you don't let it inflate you. Later that day, another colleague criticizes, "You should have done better." Without practice, those words sting, echoing in your mind long after they're spoken. But with awareness, you breathe again and note, "Unpleasant words, temporary." You listen for any truth you can learn from, then let the rest pass like a gust through open windows. This is daily practice, not escaping the world, but meeting it with clarity. Praise and blame will come no matter where you are. The question is whether you will be tossed around or whether you will learn to sail. Family life offers endless opportunities. A parent may feel the sting of blame when their child says, "You don't understand me." A spouse may glow when told, "You're perfect for me." Both moments are invitations. To the first, breathe and reflect. Perhaps there is truth I can explore, but this pain will pass. To the second, smile with gratitude, yet remember, this joy too will pass. In this gentle awareness, relationships deepen, not built on clinging to praise or recoiling from blame, but on the quiet strength of authenticity. Even in the smallest routines, the practice unfolds. Cooking dinner, driving through traffic, checking emails, moments of approval or criticism rise and fall. Each is a chance to breathe, to observe, to remember, I am more than these passing winds. One of the simplest methods is to anchor yourself in the body. When praise excites you or blame unsettles you, notice where it lands. Does your chest tighten? Does your stomach flutter? Does your jaw clench? By observing the body, you root yourself in the present moment, no longer lost in the storm of reaction. The body becomes your mountain, steady amidst shifting winds. Another practical tool is reflection. At the end of each day, pause and ask, where did I cling to praise? Where did I fear blame? What did I learn? This reflection is not about judgment, but about gentle awareness, turning each day into a teacher. Over time, something subtle changes. You begin to notice a gap between the words spoken to you and the reaction inside you. In that gap lies freedom. Praise no longer intoxicates, blame no longer enslaves. You remain steady, responding with wisdom rather than reacting with impulse. And this steadiness does not make life dull, it makes it vibrant. Free from the chains of external validation, you can act with integrity, speak with honesty, and live with courage. You no longer need to silence your truth for fear of judgment, nor inflate your ego for applause. You simply live, authentically, compassionately, and free. This is where philosophy becomes practice, where lofty teachings become lived experience. In the midst of emails, traffic, conversations, and quiet evenings, you carry the art of observing the winds. And as you do, you discover that peace is not found in escaping daily life, but in walking through it with clarity. As our journey approaches its final stages, we turn toward the greater vision, what it means to embody true equanimity. Beyond daily practice, beyond transforming praise and blame into lessons, lies the path of becoming unshakable, like the mountain, steady and serene, no matter which way the winds blow. Throughout history, the winds of praise and blame have never spared anyone, not even the awakened ones. And yet, it is precisely in their stories that we find timeless lessons on how to meet these winds with wisdom. Take the Buddha himself. During his lifetime, he was honored as a great teacher, revered by kings and peasants alike. But he was also ridiculed, accused of false deeds, even blamed for misfortunes he had no hand in. When insulted, he remained calm. When accused unjustly, he did not lash back. Once, a man hurled abuse at him, trying to provoke a reaction. The Buddha simply asked, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does it belong?" The man, puzzled, replied, "It belongs to the one who offered it." The Buddha smiled gently, "So it is with your anger, I do not accept it. it remains yours. This is not just restraint, it is clarity. The Buddha showed that blame loses its power when we refuse to internalize it. Words may be sharp, but they only wound if we carry them inside. The Zen tradition echoes this spirit in countless stories. One master was praised as a saint by his community until a young woman accused him of fathering her child. The villagers turned their reverence into condemnation overnight. When confronted, the master replied only with the words, "Is that so?" He neither defended himself nor attacked others. He simply accepted the blame handed to him without clinging to reputation. Months later, when the truth emerged and the villagers begged forgiveness, he answered again, "Is that so?" Praise or blame, it mattered little. He remained unmoved, grounded in the deeper truth beyond appearances. These stories may feel lofty, but their lessons are deeply human. They remind us that we cannot control the voices of the world. What we can control is our relationship to them. The Buddha and the masters did not allow themselves to be inflated by praise or destroyed by blame. Instead, they stood like clear mirrors, reflecting words back without distortion, without ownership. And this clarity is available to us too. When praised, we can bow inwardly with humility, not feeding the ego. When blamed, we can breathe, examine the words for truth, and let go of the rest. In both cases, the winds pass, and we remain steady. The masters also teach us that freedom lies in simplicity. Is that so? 2 words, but behind them, a lifetime of practice. A practice of letting go, of not clinging to reputation, of living authentically without fear of how others perceive us. In their lives, we see that equanimity is not cold detachment, but radiant freedom. It is the ability to meet every circumstance with openness. Praise does not swell the ego, blame does not crush the spirit. Both become opportunities to deepen compassion, humility, and wisdom. As we near the end of this journey, these lessons prepare us for the final step, bringing everything together so that we too may walk the path of equanimity, free from the restless chase of praise and the heavy shadow of blame. All along this journey, we've walked with the winds, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce. Praise has lifted us, blame has weighed us down. Yet as we've seen through the stories of the Buddha and the Zen masters, both are simply passing currents in the vast sky of life. And in that sky, there is a deeper stillness waiting to be discovered, the calm beyond the winds. This calm is not indifference. It is not a cold refusal to feel. It is the quiet strength of knowing who you are, even when the world shifts around you. It is the peace of no longer needing to chase praise or hide from blame because you've seen their nature clearly. They rise, they fall, they vanish. But awareness, the witnessing presence within you, remains. Imagine sitting at the edge of a great lake. The surface ripples with breezes, sometimes stirred into waves, sometimes calm as glass. If you stare only at the surface, you are at the mercy of every gust. But if you look deeper, you see the depths. Still, quiet, vast. This depth is your true nature. Praise and blame dance on the surface, but the calm within is untouched. When you live from this place, everything changes. Words of praise arrive, you smile, grateful but not clinging. Words of blame arrive, you listen, discern, and let go. Neither defines you, neither binds you. You are free to act from integrity, to speak from compassion, to live authentically without fear of approval or rejection. The Buddha called this freedom equanimity, a balanced heart, steady in the face of life's ups and downs. It is the foundation of wisdom, the ground of peace, and the soil where compassion blooms. For when you are no longer tossed about by the winds, you can finally turn your energy outward, not in pursuit of validation, but in service, in kindness, in love. This is the great paradox. By letting go of praise and blame, you gain something far greater than either: freedom. You discover the strength to live without masks, without fear, without the restless chase for approval. You stand like a mountain, rooted and steady, while the winds come and go. And so, as we close this journey, let us carry one truth in our hearts: the winds will always blow. But you are not the winds. You are the stillness beneath them. You are the calm beyond. When you breathe into this truth, every word of praise becomes a gentle reminder to stay humble. Every word of blame becomes a teacher of resilience, and every moment becomes an invitation to return to that quiet place inside, the place that cannot be shaken, the place that is already free. Let the winds pass. Live deeply. Stand calmly. And know, beyond praise, beyond blame, beyond the restless voices of the world, there is peace, and it is yours. If these words have touched something quiet within you, let this be more than just a passing breeze. Carry it with you, reflect on it. And if you'd like to continue walking this path of wisdom together, I invite you to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, we explore timeless teachings, not as distant philosophy, but as living guidance for the heart. Each story, each reflection, is an invitation to live with more clarity, more compassion, and more peace. So, if this resonated with you, subscribe, share this with someone who may need it, and allow these teachings to ripple gently through the world, like wind over still waters. Until next time, breathe deeply, walk calmly, and remember, beyond all the winds, your true self is already free.